The snow fell in silence over the ruins of Stalingrad. It was February 2nd, 1943, and Colonel Werner Hoffmann stood in what remained of the German Sixth Army headquarters, a concrete bunker buried beneath 15 feet of frozen rubble. The air inside tasted of gangrene and desperation. Around him, 90,000 corpses lay frozen in the positions where they had died, their bodies preserved by the -40-degree cold, like grotesque statues commemorating a defeat so complete that it had no historical precedent. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, promoted just days earlier by Hitler with the expectation that he would commit suicide rather than surrender, sat at a metal desk signing the instrument of capitulation. His hand trembled, not from cold, though the bunker was barely warmer than the street outside, not from fear. Though Soviet soldiers with submachine guns stood at every entrance, his hand trembled because he understood, with the crystalline clarity that comes only in moments of absolute failure, that this did not have to happen. Hoffmann watched the signature complete itself. He was 42 years old, an intelligence officer who had spent the last 6 months calculating the mathematical certainty of this moment. He had predicted it. He had reported it. He had warned anyone who would listen that the Sixth Army was marching into a trap that would consume 250,000 men. They had not listened. Behind the command bunker, in a smaller room that had once stored ammunition, Hoffmann found what he had come to find. Major Thomas Kepler lay against the concrete wall, his body frozen in a sitting position, his Wehrmacht greatcoat pulled tight against the cold that had killed him 3 days earlier. Thomas was 38. He had commanded an infantry battalion. He had written letters home every week until the ammunition ran out, and then the paper ran out, and finally the strength to hold a pencil ran out. He was Hoffmann's brother-in-law. He had married Elizabeth's younger sister. He had taught Hoffmann's daughters to ice skate on the Wannsee before the war. Hoffmann knelt beside the body and found the final letter in Thomas's coat pocket, sealed in wax paper to protect it from the moisture. The envelope was addressed to Elizabeth in Thomas's precise handwriting. Hoffmann did not open it. He knew what it would say. Every letter from Stalingrad said the same thing in the end. Tell them I tried. Tell them I followed orders. Tell them it wasn't supposed to end this way. A Soviet officer appeared in the doorway and gestured for Hoffmann to leave. The inspection was over. The evaluation was complete. Hoffmann had been sent to assess the condition of the pocket in its final days, to provide intelligence for future planning. As if there would be a future that required this particular knowledge, he stood and walked past Thomas without looking back, because looking back changed nothing. And because the mathematics of this defeat had been clear for months, and because 90,000 frozen corpses represented not a battle lost, but a decision made at the highest levels to sacrifice these men for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity. Outside, the February wind carved through the ruins. Hoffmann climbed into the back of a Kubelwagen that would take him to the airfield where a Heinkel was waiting to fly him back to Army Group headquarters. As the vehicle navigated through streets lined with destroyed tanks and dead horses in the scattered detritus of a siege that had consumed everything it touched, Hoffmann closed his eyes and went back to where this had started. Summer, 1942. The sun blazed over the Ukrainian steppe as Operation Blue unfolded with a speed that seemed to vindicate everything Hitler had promised. German panzers raced eastward across terrain so flat you could see the curve of the earth, covering in weeks what had taken months the previous summer. Soviet armies that had fought with fanatical determination the year before now melted away, withdrawing instead of standing, leaving entire cities undefended. At the Foreign Armies East Intelligence Section and Army Group South headquarters, Colonel Werner Hoffmann tracked the advance on maps that had to be redrawn daily. The blue arrows representing German divisions pushed deeper into Soviet territory with each update. By August, mountain troops had planted the swastika on Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in the Caucasus. The oil fields of Baku seemed within reach, but Hoffmann had learned in 2 years of war on the Eastern Front that spectacular advances could deceive. He studied the intelligence reports from reconnaissance flights and signal intercepts and prisoner interrogations, and he saw patterns that troubled him. Soviet forces were not fighting to the death as they had at Moscow and Leningrad. They were conducting fighting withdrawals, trading space for time, preserving their strength. And behind the front lines, in the deep rear areas beyond the range of German reconnaissance, something was happening that the reports could not fully explain. New armies were appearing on the order of battle. Divisions that had not existed when Operation Blue began were now identified through radio traffic and prisoner statements. Where was Stalin getting these men? More importantly, where was he planning to use them? Hoffmann raised these concerns during the morning intelligence briefings. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, listened with the tired attention of a man who knew his advice was no longer valued at the highest levels. Halder had opposed the offensive's design from the beginning. Hitler had split Army Group South into 2 separate axes, one driving toward Stalingrad, the other toward the Caucasus oil fields. This divided German strength and created a gap between the two forces that kept widening as they advanced. Elementary operational planning suggested concentration of force. Hitler's strategy guaranteed dispersion. But Hitler had an obsession that overrode operational logic. He wanted Stalingrad, not because the city had overwhelming strategic value, but because it bore Stalin's name. The propaganda value was immeasurable. He insisted capturing the city would humiliate the Soviet dictator and demonstrate to the world that German will could overcome any obstacle. By late August, the Sixth Army under Field Marshal Paulus was approaching the outskirts of Stalingrad. Hoffmann knew Paulus slightly from staff functions. He was 52, a meticulous planner who had helped design the invasion of Poland and France. He was not a field commander by temperament. He was a staff officer, promoted beyond his comfort level, a man who followed orders and trusted the chain of command. Hoffmann's friend, General Heinrich Steiner, commanded one of the divisions driving toward the city. Steiner was 54, a career soldier who had fought in the previous war as a lieutenant and risen through the ranks on merit rather than connections. He was a professional in the truest sense, a man who understood tactics and logistics and the capabilities of his troops with the precision of someone who had spent 3 decades learning his craft. They had met in 1938 at a training exercise in Prussia. Hoffmann had provided intelligence assessments that helped Steiner's division win the war game. Afterward, over drinks in the officers' mess, they had discovered a shared skepticism about the regime's grandiose claims. Neither man was political. They served Germany, not the National Socialist Party, but they were educated enough to recognize propaganda when they heard it, and professional enough to worry about strategy built on ideology rather than capability. That friendship had survived 2 years of war. They met when headquarters duties brought them to the same location, usually for coffee in whatever building was serving as a temporary command post. They talked about the war with the frankness that comes from mutual respect and the knowledge that neither would repeat what was said. In early September, Steiner's division entered Stalingrad's outskirts. Hoffmann received his reports with growing unease. The fighting was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had encountered. Soviet defenders under General Vasily Zhukov had invented new tactics for urban warfare, tactics that negated every German advantage. Instead of defending in depth, Zhukov kept his forces within grenade-throwing distance of the German lines. He called it hugging the enemy. This meant German artillery could not fire without hitting their own troops. Luftwaffe bombers could not attack forward positions without risking German casualties. The battle devolved into savage close-quarters combat in factories and apartment buildings, in sewers and railroad yards. Steiner's reports described fighting for individual buildings that took days. The grain elevator on the Volga riverfront consumed an entire week and cost over 200 casualties for a structure that had no strategic value beyond the fact that Soviet soldiers were defending it. Men died for staircases. They died for rooms. They died for cellars filled with polluted water and the corpses of previous assaults. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Hoffmann calculated the loss rates and extrapolated forward. At current attrition, Steiner's division would be combat ineffective within 6 weeks, and Steiner's division was only one of 22 divisions grinding themselves to pieces in the ruins. This was not warfare. This was mutual annihilation in slow motion. What Hoffmann did not know, what he could not know because Soviet operational security was better than German intelligence could penetrate, was that every day German forces spent destroying Stalingrad was a day that Marshal Georgy Zhukov used to prepare the counteroffensive that would change the war. Zhukov understood what Hitler did not. Stalingrad had become a magnet, drawing in German strength and holding it fixed while Soviet reserves accumulated on the flanks. The Sixth Army's flanks were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian satellite armies with inferior equipment and low morale. Zhukov planned to smash through these weak points, drive deep into the German rear, and encircle Stalingrad, trapping the entire Sixth Army inside. The buildup was enormous. Over 1 million men, 13,500 guns and mortars, 900 tanks, 1,400 aircraft. All of this concentrated in forests and ravines north and south of the city, camouflaged with a sophistication that German reconnaissance could not penetrate. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen's intelligence section at Foreign Armies East detected only fragments of the concentration. Radio intercepts suggested major troop movements. Prisoner interrogations mentioned new divisions. Aerial reconnaissance spotted tank formations moving at night. Gehlen reported these findings up the chain of command with increasing urgency. Something big was coming. The exact timing and location remained unclear, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Soviets were preparing a major operation. On November 10th, Hoffmann decoded a series of Soviet radio transmissions that had been intercepted by a listening post near the Don River. The signal's traffic was fragmentary and heavily encrypted, but the volume and pattern matched preparations for a large-scale offensive. Hoffmann spent 48 hours analyzing the intercepts. cross-referencing them with reconnaissance reports and prisoner statements. His conclusion was unambiguous. A major Soviet counteroffensive was imminent. Target: the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad and the Romanian Fourth Army to the south. Objective: encirclement of the German Sixth Army. Timing: within 2 weeks, possibly sooner. Forces in WW2 estimated at 800,000 to 1 million men, with significant armor and artillery support. Hoffmann prepared a detailed briefing and presented it to General Maximilian von Weichs, commander of Army Group B. Von Weichs listened without interruption. When Hoffmann finished, the general studied the maps in silence. "Do you believe this assessment?" "Colonel, I do." "Sir, the indicators are consistent across multiple intelligence sources." Von Weichs nodded slowly. "I will forward this to the Führer's headquarters with my recommendation for immediate defensive measures." 3 days later, the response came back through General Kurt Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as Army Chief of Staff in September. "The Führer has reviewed the intelligence assessment. He considers Soviet capabilities to be grossly exaggerated. The Soviets are broken. Victory at Stalingrad is days away. The offensive will continue." Hoffmann read the message twice, then filed it in the intelligence archive. He understood in that moment something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Professional expertise meant nothing when leadership refused to accept reality. He had done his job. He had analyzed the data. He had reported the threat. The fact that his analysis was ignored did not change its accuracy. It only changed who would be held responsible when the predictions came true. That evening, Hoffmann wrote a carefully worded letter to Thomas, who commanded an infantry battalion in Steiner's division. The letter discussed family matters and made no direct mention of classified intelligence. But buried in mundane details about Elizabeth and the girls was a suggestion that Thomas might want to position his battalion for rapid withdrawal westward if circumstances permitted. The letter never reached Thomas. By the time it arrived at division mail call, circumstances had overtaken suggestion. November 19th, 1942. The Soviet offensive began at 7:30 in the morning with an artillery barrage of such intensity that German soldiers who survived would describe it decades later with voices still trembling. Over 3,000 guns opened fire simultaneously across a 40-mile front north of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Then came the tanks. T-34s and KV-1s crashed through the Romanian positions in fog so thick that German artillery observers could not see to call in counterfire. The Romanian Third Army, which had looked adequate on paper, collapsed within hours. Some units dissolved completely, soldiers fleeing east or surrendering in place. By the end of the first day, Soviet mobile forces had advanced 40 miles into the German rear. November 20th, the southern pincer struck. The Romanian Fourth Army shattered under an identical assault. Now 2 massive Soviet pincers were driving toward each other, aimed at the town of Kalach, 50 miles west of Stalingrad. If they met, the entire Sixth Army would be trapped. At Army Group B headquarters, Hoffmann watched the situation maps update with the mechanical detachment that comes from having predicted exactly this outcome. Von Weichs recognized immediately that the only rational response was withdrawal. The Sixth Army must break out toward the west before the encirclement closed. But Paulus hesitated. He was a staff officer by temperament, a man who followed orders and respected the chain of command. He radioed Hitler's headquarters requesting instructions. Should he break out or hold position? In Steiner's division, officers prepared for withdrawal without waiting for authorization. They assembled assault groups at the western edge of the pocket. They stockpiled ammunition. They identified the most direct routes west. They waited for the order. Thomas's battalion was positioned near the Volga, holding a section of the riverfront against Soviet attacks that came every night. When the orders arrived to prepare for possible breakout, Thomas gathered his company commanders and laid out the plan. They would move west in columns from, fighting through any Soviet blocking forces, abandoning heavy equipment if necessary. The objective was to reach German lines. Everything else was secondary. The men understood. They had been fighting in Stalingrad for 2 months. They knew the statistics. They knew that continuing the battle in the city meant death by increments. Breakout offered casualties but also survival for some percentage of the force. They packed their gear and waited. November 22nd. Hitler's response arrived. The Sixth Army will not retreat. It will form a hedgehog defense and hold Stalingrad. Reichsmarshal Goering assures that the Luftwaffe can supply the pocket by air. All units will stand fast. Paulus read the order and obeyed. In Thomas's battalion, the order to stand down spread from company to company. Men who had been preparing to fight their way west now returned to their defensive positions along the Volga. Some cursed, some wept. Most said nothing, because what was there to say? They were soldiers. Soldiers followed orders. November 23rd. Soviet forces met at Kalach. The encirclement was complete. 250,000 German and Romanian troops were trapped inside a pocket roughly 30 miles across. The Sixth Army had become the Sixth Army Pocket. That evening, Hoffmann met Steiner at a road junction outside the encirclement, where Steiner's Corps headquarters was coordinating efforts to establish defensive lines. Steiner had aged 10 years in 4 days. His face was gray with exhaustion and something deeper than exhaustion. They stood beside a Kubelwagen in the November cold and did not salute because formality seemed obscene. "Your intelligence was correct," Steiner said. His voice was flat. "They should have listened." Hoffmann said nothing. What response could encompass the magnitude of what had just happened? "My division is inside," Steiner continued. 8,000 men. Thomas's battalion is with them. "I know. Goering says the Luftwaffe can supply them." Hoffmann looked at his friend and saw that Steiner did not believe this any more than he did. The Luftwaffe had never supplied an encircled force of this size. Not in ideal conditions. Certainly not in Russian winter. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. The best the Luftwaffe had ever achieved was 300 tons per day to Demyansk. Under better weather and with shorter flight distances. The mathematics were simple. The Sixth Army would starve. How long? Steiner asked. Hoffmann calculated. 3 weeks on full rations. 6 weeks on reduced rations. After that, conditions deteriorate rapidly. 2 months maximum before combat capability reaches zero. Steiner nodded. He looked toward the east, toward the ruins of Stalingrad, somewhere beyond the horizon where 8,000 of his men were digging into frozen ground and preparing to defend positions they could not hold against an enemy that would not stop attacking. "We're soldiers," Steiner said quietly. "We follow orders." Hoffmann felt something crack inside his chest. It was a small sound, like ice breaking on a pond. But once it started, it would not stop, even when the orders guaranteed death. Steiner turned to face him. "We took an oath to follow the Führer's commands, to defend Germany against her enemies. That oath doesn't have exceptions for when we disagree with strategy. This isn't strategy. This is a murder by command decision." The words hung in the frozen air between them. Steiner's face hardened. "Be careful, Werner. That's defeatism. Men have been shot for less. Men are being shot anyway. 250,000 of them. Over the next 2 months, because someone refused to authorize a withdrawal that could have saved most of them." Steiner stepped closer. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "What would you have me do? Disobey direct orders? Encourage my men to mutiny? I'm a general in the German Wehrmacht. I follow the chain of command. That's what professional soldiers do." Hoffmann met his friend's eyes and saw the gulf that had opened between them. It was not about tactics or intelligence assessments. It was about something more fundamental. They inhabited different moral universes now. Steiner believed that professional duty meant obedience regardless of outcome. Hoffmann was beginning to understand that professional duty might sometimes require disobedience precisely because of outcome. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Steiner climbed back into his vehicle and drove toward his headquarters without another word. Hoffmann watched him go and understood that something in their friendship had broken, that would not be repaired by survival or time. The airlift began on November 25th. The Luftwaffe had assembled every available transport aircraft and promised to deliver the 700 tons per day that the Sixth Army required. Weather was poor. Soviet fighters had established air superiority over the pocket. The transport planes were slow, vulnerable targets. On the first day, the Luftwaffe delivered 30 tons. By December, the average was 94 tons per day, less than 15% of requirement. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army began to starve. Rations were cut, then cut again. Horses were slaughtered for meat. When the horses were gone, men began to die. First the wounded, who had no reserves of strength, then the sick, then the merely unlucky. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's finest operational commander, assembled a relief force and launched Operation Winter Storm on December 12th. The plan was to drive northeast from Kotelnikovo with the 4th Panzer Army, smash through the Soviet outer encirclement, and open a corridor to Stalingrad. Hoffmann tracked the relief attempt with the careful attention of someone watching his own predictions play out in real time. He calculated that if the relief force reached within 20 miles, and if Paulus launched a simultaneous breakout from inside the pocket, there was approximately a 60% chance of linking up successfully. Casualties would be heavy. Heavy equipment would be lost. But a significant portion of the Sixth Army could be saved. The key variable was Paulus. He had to be willing to break out against Hitler's orders. The 4th Panzer Army, led by the elite 6th Panzer Division, punched through Soviet defenses and advanced nearly 60 miles in the first week. By December 19th, German tanks were within 30 miles of the pocket. Inside Stalingrad, Thomas's battalion heard the distant rumble of tank guns. Officers gathered their men and explained that relief was coming. Prepare for breakout. Check ammunition. Fill canteens. Be ready to move within 6 hours. The mood in Thomas's command post approached something like hope. For the first time in a month, survival seemed possible. Not guaranteed, not even likely, but possible. Thomas wrote a final letter to Elizabeth. He did not know if it would ever reach her. But he wrote it anyway because the alternative was to say nothing. And soldiers about to fight their way through an encirclement should be allowed to say goodbye. The letter was 3 pages long. It talked about the girls and how much he missed them. It talked about the house on the Wannsee and the ice skating and the summer picnics before the war. It talked about hope and duty and the obligation to try. The last paragraph said, "Tell Werner he was right. Tell him the intelligence was correct. Tell him that when this is over, when we've won or lost or found some middle ground between victory and defeat, tell him that professional soldiers should maybe question more and obey less. Tell him I learned that too late." Thomas sealed the letter in wax paper and put it in his coat pocket. Then he went to brief his company commanders on the breakout plan. That evening, December 9th, a radio message arrived from Führer headquarters via Army Group Don. Under no circumstances is the 6th Army to abandon Stalingrad. They must hold their positions and wait for the relief force to reach them. Goering's aircraft will sustain the pocket until relief arrives. Paulus read the order and obeyed. The breakout was canceled. Assault groups stood down. Thomas's battalion returned to defensive positions along the Volga. In the 4th Panzer Army, Manstein received word that Paulus would not break out. He understood immediately what this meant. His relief force had shot its bolt. Soviet reserves were arriving. In a few days, perhaps a week, he would be forced to withdraw or risk encirclement himself. He sent urgent messages to Hitler's headquarters. Authorize the breakout or the 6th Army is doomed. Hitler refused. The Luftwaffe will supply them. Hold fast. On December 23rd, Soviet forces counterattacked against Manstein's flanks. Within days, the 4th Panzer Army was in full retreat. The last chance to save the 6th Army had passed. Hoffmann prepared the casualty projections sitting alone in the intelligence section at 3 o'clock in the morning because night was when the numbers became unbearable. He calculated time until starvation reached critical levels. He calculated casualty rates from cold and disease. He calculated the tonnage deficit in the airlift multiplied by days remaining. Every calculation produced the same result. The 6th Army would cease to exist as a fighting force by the end of January. Approximately 40,000 men might be evacuated by air, mostly wounded. The rest would die or be captured. Of those captured, Soviet prison camps in winter would kill the majority within months. Final estimate, 230,000 dead. Minimum, all preventable. All the direct result of one decision on November 22nd to order men to stand fast instead of authorizing withdrawal. Hoffmann closed the notebook and sat in the dark room and understood with terrible clarity that this was only the beginning. Stalingrad was not an aberration. It was a preview of how the war would be conducted from now on. Intelligence would be ignored. Professional advice would be dismissed. Hundreds of thousands of men would be sacrificed not for strategic objectives, but for symbolic victories that meant nothing except in the fevered imagination of a leadership divorced from reality. And the worst part, the part that Hoffmann could barely acknowledge even to himself, was that he would continue to do his job. He would analyze intelligence. He would brief commanders. He would prepare reports that documented the unfolding catastrophe with professional precision. Because what else could he do? Resign. Refuse orders. Those options led to court-martial and execution. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Berlin. He had responsibilities. Or that was what he told himself in the dark room at 3 in the morning, while 230,000 men froze to death in the ruins of Stalingrad because someone decided that obeying orders mattered more than saving lives. The Soviet final offensive against the pocket began on January 10th. The attack was preceded by an ultimatum offering honorable surrender, medical treatment for the wounded, and repatriation after the war. Paulus forwarded the ultimatum to Hitler and requested permission to accept. Hitler's response was brief. Surrender is forbidden. The 6th Army will fight to the last man and last bullet. So the attack began. Over 2,000 Soviet guns opened fire on the western edge of the pocket. Then came the infantry, advancing through snowstorms behind tanks and assault guns. German defenses, manned by starving, frostbitten troops with dwindling ammunition. Crumbled, Thomas's battalion held the riverfront for 3 days. On the 3rd day, they ran out of ammunition. Soviet troops overran the position. Thomas and 17 of his men retreated to a basement bunker. They had no food, no water, no way to communicate with higher headquarters. They sat in the dark and waited for something that did not come. By January 25th, the Soviets had split the pocket in 2. The northern group was compressed into the ruins of the tractor factory. The southern group held the city center. There was no communication between them. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. The implication was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus should shoot himself rather than accept capture. Paulus, worn down by weeks of starvation and stress, his face gray and his eyes sunken, had given up on Hitler's promises. On February 2nd, he surrendered. Hoffmann flew into the pocket that morning on one of the last evacuation flights. He carried authorization to inspect conditions and prepare a report. The plane landed on a runway cratered by Soviet artillery. The pilot kept the engines running. Hoffmann had 2 hours. He found the command bunker. He found Paulus signing the surrender. He found 90,000 frozen corpses in the ruins. And in a storage room behind the command post, he found Thomas's body sitting against a concrete wall, frozen in the position where he had died 3 days after the ammunition ran out. Hoffmann knelt beside his brother-in-law and retrieved the letter from his coat pocket. The envelope was frozen. The wax paper had preserved it. The handwriting was still precise. A Soviet officer appeared in the doorway and gestured, "Time to leave." Hoffmann stood and walked out of the bunker into February sunlight that reflected off snow and ruins and the scattered wreckage of an army that had died because someone ordered them to stand fast. The Kubelwagen drove him to the airfield. The Heinkel lifted off and climbed through thin clouds toward the west. Below, Stalingrad spread out like a wound in the earth, smoking and broken and littered with the evidence of decisions made far from the battlefield by men who would never see the consequences. Hoffmann held Thomas's letter in his hand and thought about mathematics. 250,000 men trapped. 90,000 died in the pocket. 190,000 captured. Of those, approximately 5,000 would survive Soviet prison camps to return to Germany. Total dead, 245,000, all preventable. He had known this would happen. He had reported it. No one had listened. And now he understood something that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. Professional expertise was not enough. Accurate intelligence was not enough. Doing your job was not enough. Because doing your job while ignoring the moral implications of that job was not neutrality. It was complicity. The terrible knowledge had come to Colonel Werner Hoffmann on November 10, 1942. When he decoded Soviet radio intercepts and calculated that a catastrophe was imminent, he had done everything professional duty required. He had reported up the chain of command. He had documented his findings. He had tried to warn his friend's brother-in-law with a coded letter. None of it had mattered. And now 90,000 frozen corpses in Stalingrad and 155,000 dying slowly in Soviet camps stood as testament to the fact that professional competence, divorced from moral courage, was not enough to prevent atrocity. It was only enough to document it afterward with meticulous precision. The Heinkel banked west toward Army Group headquarters where Hoffmann would file his report and attend briefings and continue his work because the alternative was to refuse orders and face execution and abandon his family. Below, Stalingrad disappeared behind clouds. The terrible knowledge remained. March 43. The intelligence briefing room at Army Group South headquarters smelled of cigarette smoke and mimeograph chemicals. Spring rain drummed against the windows overlooking what remained of Kharkov, a city that had changed hands 4 times in 18 months and now belonged to Germany again. Though for how long, no one could say with confidence. Colonel Werner Hoffmann stood before a wall-sized map of the Eastern Front and prepared to deliver an assessment that would end any remaining illusions about how this war would conclude. He had been promoted after Stalingrad, though whether the promotion represented recognition of his analytical accuracy or an attempt to implicate him in the command structure's failures, he could not determine. Either way, he now held responsibility for strategic intelligence assessment across the entire southern sector. 15 officers filled the room. Major generals and lieutenant generals and 1 field marshal, men with decades of military service and decorations from 2 wars, men who understood tactics and logistics and the operational art of warfare with the precision that came from lifelong study. They were about to learn that none of that mattered anymore. Hoffmann began with production statistics. The numbers appeared on a slide projected against the white wall, black text on white background. No embellishment, just mathematics. Soviet tank production, 1942, 24,700 units. German tank production, 1942, 9,300 units. The ratio was 2.6 to 1. Hoffmann let that settle for a moment before advancing to the next slide. Soviet aircraft production, 1942, 21,800 combat aircraft. German aircraft production, 1942, 15,400 combat aircraft. Ratio, 1.4 to 1. Another slide. United States production, 1942, 47,800 aircraft, 10,800 tanks. And the Americans were just beginning their industrial mobilization. By 1944, those numbers would double, possibly triple. Hoffmann looked at the faces watching him. Some showed no expression. Others had begun to calculate, their eyes moving as they processed implications. General Georg Thomas has provided an economic assessment. Hoffmann continued. His voice was steady. 2 years ago, General Thomas calculated that Germany needed either a quick victory or access to Soviet resources to sustain a long war of attrition. We have achieved neither. The quick victory failed in December 1941 outside Moscow. Soviet resources remained denied. And the United States, with industrial capacity exceeding Germany and the Soviet Union combined, entered the war in December 1941. He advanced to the next slide. It showed projected production through 1943 and 1944. The curves diverged like the banks of a river in flood. Soviet and American production climbing. German production flat or declining as factories were destroyed by bombing and raw materials became scarce. The conclusion is unavoidable. Germany cannot win a long war of industrial attrition. We are outnumbered, outproduced, and fighting on multiple fronts against enemies whose combined resources exceed ours by a factor of 10 to 1. Silence filled the room. The rain continued against the windows. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. The field marshal, an older man whose name Hoffmann had learned not to mention in reports because the man's closeness to Hitler made him untouchable, cleared his throat. This analysis is defeatist. Hoffmann met his eyes. This analysis is mathematical. The numbers exist independent of our interpretation. Numbers can be manipulated. Statistics can deceive. Not these statistics. Sir, Soviet tank production is verified through multiple intelligence sources, including signals intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance of factory complexes beyond the Urals. American production numbers come from their own published reports. They are not hiding their capabilities. They are advertising them. The field marshal stood and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. Professional officers do not traffic in despair. Colonel Werner, I suggest you reconsider your conclusions before presenting them in official reports. The door closed. The remaining officers sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, one major general asked the question they were all thinking. What is the timeline? For what? Sir, until we lose. Hoffmann had prepared this calculation. If the Soviets maintain current offensive tempo, and if the Western Allies invade France in 1940, Germany's ability to hold current territorial positions degrades continuously. Critical failure points. Loss of Crimea and Ukraine in 1944. Loss of Poland and Romania by early 1945. Soviet armies reach German soil by mid-1945. Western Front collapse accelerates once France is invaded. Estimate 18 to 24 months until military defeat becomes inevitable. He did not add what he was thinking, that this assumed Germany fought with professional competence and realistic strategy. If Hitler continued to interfere in operational decisions the way he had at Stalingrad, the timeline could compress significantly. The briefing ended. Officers filed out without speaking. Hoffmann gathered his notes and walked to his office. A small room on the second floor with a window overlooking the rail yards, where supply trains arrived daily with diminishing loads. That evening, he wrote a letter to Elizabeth in Berlin. He did not mention the briefing or the production statistics or his conclusion that the war was lost. Letters were censored. Such content would result in immediate arrest. Instead, he wrote about mundane things. He asked about the girl's schooling. He mentioned that spring was arriving early this year. He suggested, carefully, that she might consider visiting her cousin in Bavaria for an extended stay. The cousin's estate was far from any strategic targets. The bombing was unlikely to reach that far south, between the lines. If she read carefully, Elizabeth would understand that he was telling her to leave Berlin. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. She and the girls would visit Bavaria in early summer. They would stay as long as necessary. She did not mention how long necessary might be. She did not need to. They had been married to 16 years. They understood each other's silences. May 1943. General Heinrich Steiner's promotion to Corps Command came through in April, a recognition of his performance during the winter retreats. He now controlled 3 divisions, approximately 35,000 men, tasked with holding a 60-mile sector of front line west of Kursk. Hoffmann met him in a cafe that had somehow survived the fighting. A small establishment on a side street in Kharkov, where the owner still served real coffee if you knew to ask. They sat at a corner table away from other patrons and spoke in voices that would not carry. Steiner looked older. The winter had carved lines around his eyes and mouth that made him appear 10 years past his 54th. But his posture remained rigid, his uniform immaculate, his bearing that of a professional soldier who maintained standards regardless of circumstances. They discussed the spring mud and the challenges of supply and the eternal problem of reinforcements that never arrived in sufficient numbers. Then Steiner asked the question that was really the reason for this meeting. You briefed production statistics last month. I heard about it through channels. Hoffmann sipped his coffee. It was bitter and weak. I briefed what the intelligence showed. And what does the intelligence show? That we cannot win a long war. Steiner's expression did not change. He had already known this. Every educated officer knew it. The question was what you did with the knowledge. So what do we do? Hoffmann asked. We fight until ordered to stop. That's what soldiers do. Even if fighting accomplishes nothing except to delay defeat and multiply casualties. Steiner set down his cup. Its weight against the saucer made a small sound in the quiet cafe. Werner, we are professional officers in the Wehrmacht. We took an oath, not to victory, not to success, to obedience, to the lawful execution of orders from our chain of command. That oath does not have an exception clause for when we calculate that continuing is futile. What about an exception for when continuing is immoral? The word hung between them like a physical presence. Steiner's jaw tightened. Careful. I am being careful. I am speaking only to you, in a cafe where no one can hear us, about a question that every thinking officer in this army is asking himself. And what question is that? Whether professional duty requires us to continue killing and dying for a cause that is already lost. Whether obedience to orders absolves us of responsibility for the consequences of those orders. Whether there comes a point when following orders becomes participation in something we know is wrong. Steiner leaned forward. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You are describing mutiny. You are describing treason. You are describing the kind of thinking that gets men hanged from meat hooks in Gestapo basements. I am describing a moral calculation that we are all making whether we admit it or not. I have made no such calculation. I serve Germany. I follow orders. When the war ends, however it ends, I will surrender my sword to whoever demands it and accept whatever judgment comes. But while I wear this uniform, I will do my duty as a soldier, even if your duty requires you to waste lives for objectives you know are unattainable. Steiner stood. The conversation was over. He placed money on the table for his coffee and looked down at Hoffmann with something approaching pity. You always were too clever. Werner, too analytical. The Army needs intelligence officers like you, but it also needs soldiers who understand that not every decision requires analysis. Sometimes you simply obey because that is what soldiers do. I suggest you remember which type of officer you are supposed to be. He walked out. Hoffmann sat alone in the cafe and finished his bitter coffee and understood that whatever friendship had existed between them was now compromised by a fundamental disagreement about what duty meant. Outside, spring rain began to fall again. June 1843. Operation Citadel existed on paper as a masterpiece of operational planning. Two massive panzer armies would strike the Kursk salient from north and south, meet behind the city, and trap perhaps 500,000 Soviet troops inside. It would be the greatest encirclement battle since 1941, a demonstration that the Wehrmacht could still achieve decisive victory. Hoffmann was assigned to the intelligence assessment team. He spent 6 weeks analyzing Soviet defensive preparations and understood within days that Citadel was doomed. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. They had 5 months to prepare while Hitler delayed the offensive, waiting for new Tiger and Panther tanks. In those 5 months, they had created defensive zones extending over 100 miles deep. They had laid 500,000 mines. They had positioned artillery in carefully planned killing zones. They had built anti-tank ditches and bunker complexes and firing positions that would channel German armor into pre-sighted fields of fire. Hoffmann's assessment concluded that even if the attack achieved tactical surprise, which was unlikely, and even if the new German tanks performed as advertised, which was uncertain, the offensive would stall within days against defenses too deep to penetrate. Success probability, less than 15%. He presented this assessment at a planning conference in early May. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German panzer warfare, supported the conclusion. He told Hitler directly, the attack will cost us heavily in men and equipment. We will achieve nothing. Hitler's response was telling. He said the very thought of the offensive made his stomach turn over. Guderian asked the obvious question. Then why do it at all? Because we need a victory. Because German prestige must be restored. Because the world must see that Germany can still attack, can still win. None of these were military reasons. They were emotional reasons. Political reasons. The kind of reasoning that began with the conclusion and worked backward to justify it. The offensive was scheduled for early July. Every week of delay allowed the Soviets to strengthen their defenses. By the time the attack finally began on July 5th, the Soviet defensive system had reached a level of sophistication that the Germans could not overcome with the forces available. In the north, General Model's 9th Army attacked with 300,000 men and 900 tanks. They crashed into Soviet defenses and were swallowed. After 1 week, Model had advanced 6 miles. He needed to advance 60 miles to close the pocket. The northern pincer had failed. In the south, Manstein's forces did better initially. They had stronger armored units, including the elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps, with nearly 600 tanks. By July 12th, they had penetrated 30 miles and were approaching the town of Prokhorovka. Hoffmann tracked the battle from Army Group South headquarters. The reports came in hourly. Initial successes, heavy casualties, steady advance, Soviet reserves appearing, progress slowing. On July 12th, the largest tank battle in history occurred on open ground southwest of Prokhorovka. Approximately 600 German tanks and assault guns engaged over 800 Soviet tanks. The battle lasted all day in swirling dust and smoke, with visibility sometimes measured in meters. Soviet commanders, knowing they were outmatched in armor and firepower, ordered their T-34s to charge straight into the German formations at maximum speed. This closed the range to point blank and negated the Tiger tank's advantages. The battlefield became a swirling melee of burning vehicles and explosions, and men dying in metal boxes that had become crematoriums. When the dust settled and the surviving tanks withdrew, the Soviets had lost 300 to 400 tanks. The Germans had lost perhaps 70. By traditional metrics, it was a German tactical victory. But strategically, it meant nothing. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been stopped. It would not advance further. The southern pincer would not reach its objective. And that same day, July 12th, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive against the Ural salient north of Kursk. Now the Germans faced not just a stalled offensive, but a potential breakthrough in their own lines. July 13th, Hitler summoned his field marshals to headquarters in East Prussia. He canceled Operation Citadel. The Anglo-Americans had landed in Sicily on July 10th. Forces were needed in Italy. The offensive was over. Manstein protested. His troops were on the verge of breakthrough. Give him one more week, and he would close the pocket. Hitler refused. Citadel was finished. Hoffmann prepared the after-action assessment. The conclusion was stark. Operation Citadel had demonstrated that Germany could no longer achieve operational-level victories on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht in 1943 could win tactical engagements. It possessed superior equipment and better trained personnel, and officers who understood mobile warfare at a level the Soviets were still learning. But none of that mattered at the operational scale. The Soviets had learned to defend in depth. They had massive reserves. They could absorb German attacks and then counterattack with fresh forces. And they had production capacity that allowed them to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The mathematics were brutal. Germany could win 10 Prokhorovkas, and it would not change the strategic balance. The Soviets could afford to lose 3 tanks for every 1 German tank destroyed. Germany could not afford to lose even 1 tank for 3 Soviet tanks destroyed because Germany was running out of tanks and fuel and trained crews. After Kursk, there would be no more German offensives. From July 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht would fight a defensive war, trading space for time, hoping for some miracle that would allow Germany to negotiate an acceptable peace before Soviet armies reached Berlin. That miracle was not coming. Hoffmann understood this. Guderian understood this. Manstein understood this. Most of the senior commanders understood this. And they kept fighting, August through November 1943. The Soviet counteroffensive after Kursk was devastating in scope and execution. The Red Army that attacked in August 1943 was not the same force that had barely survived in 1941. It had grown to approximately 6 million men in frontline combat units, supported by 4 million more in reserves and rear services. They had mastered operational art, the ability to coordinate multi-front operations, sustain offensives over long distances, and achieve breakthrough without losing momentum. And they had artillery. At Kursk, Soviet gun density had exceeded 150 artillery pieces per mile of front in key sectors. When that firepower was unleashed in the counteroffensive, German defensive positions simply disintegrated. Hoffmann tracked the Soviet advances on maps that had to be updated daily as cities fell. Orel liberated in August, Belgorod in August, Smolensk in September. The Soviets crossed the Dnieper River in October at multiple points, overwhelming the so-called impregnable defensive barrier in weeks. Kiev fell in November. The rate of advance was accelerating. Between November 1943 and June 1944, the Red Army would advance approximately 400 miles from the Dnieper to the borders of Poland and Romania. At current tempo, they would reach German pre-war borders by late 1944, and there was nothing the Wehrmacht could do to stop them. Only slow them, trade casualties for time, make every mile costly, hope that eventually the Soviets would exhaust themselves or the Western Allies would recognize that Soviet Russia represented a greater threat than Germany. It was a strategy built on wishful thinking and desperation. In the Mediterranean, the situation was equally dire. The Africa Corps had surrendered in Tunisia in May, losing another 250,000 Axis troops. Sicily fell in August after a brief campaign. British and Canadian forces invaded the Italian mainland on September 3rd. Italy surrendered on September 8th. though German forces quickly occupied much of the country and established defensive lines. And over Germany itself, the cities burned. The British Bomber Command had begun area bombing in 1942, but the campaign intensified dramatically in 1943. Hamburg, in late July. Operation Gomorrah created the first artificial firestorm, killing over 40,000 civilians in a single night. Cologne, Essen, Dortmund, Düsseldorf. All the great industrial cities of the Ruhr were repeatedly attacked. The Americans joined with daylight precision bombing, targeting ball-bearing factories and aircraft plants and oil refineries. German fighter defenses inflicted heavy losses on the bomber streams, but the raids continued. By late 1943, Germany was losing the air war over its own territory. Hoffmann requested that Elizabeth and the girls remain in Bavaria. She wrote back that they were safe, that the estate was far from anything of military value, that the cousins were kind hosts. She asked when he might visit. He replied that he did not know. Between the lines, probably not until the war ended. One way or another, October 1943, the approach came quietly, through intermediaries, with the careful deniability that conspiracies require. A major on the general staff, whom Hoffmann knew slightly, asked if he might attend a small gathering of officers interested in discussing strategic planning. The invitation was coded. Strategic planning meant something other than maps and logistics. The gathering took place in a Berlin apartment during one of Hoffmann's rare visits to the capital. 6 officers were present, none above the rank of colonel. They spoke carefully at first, testing each other with oblique comments about the war's direction. Gradually, the conversation became more direct. Germany could not win. This was accepted as foundational truth. The question was what to do about it. One option was to continue fighting until total defeat. The other option was to remove Hitler and seek negotiated peace with the Western Allies. The conspiracy was not new. There had been attempts to kill Hitler dating back to 1938. All had failed due to luck or inadequate planning or last-minute changes in Hitler's schedule. But the conspirators persisted because they believed, with varying degrees of realism, that Germany without Hitler might avoid the worst outcomes of total defeat. Hoffmann listened more than he spoke. He understood within an hour that he was not being recruited as an active participant. His value was intelligence access. The conspirators wanted to know what the Allies might accept as peace terms. They wanted to understand Soviet offensive capabilities. They wanted information that would help them plan for a post-Hitler Germany. They did not ask him to join them directly because that would implicate him. Instead, they asked if he might be willing to provide intelligence assessments on specific questions. Hypothetically, in the interest of planning for various contingencies, Hoffmann looked at these men, fellow officers, educated professionals who had concluded that continuing to follow orders meant complicity in Germany's destruction. Some of them would die in the attempt to stop that destruction. All of them were risking execution simply by meeting in this room. He thought about Thomas frozen in a Stalingrad bunker. He thought about Steiner's rigid insistence on professional duty. He thought about Elizabeth and the girls in Bavaria and what kind of Germany they would inherit if this war continued to its logical conclusion. I can provide intelligence assessments, he said carefully, on hypothetical contingencies. In my professional capacity, it was not a commitment to join the conspiracy. It was not even really a commitment to help them. It was simply an acknowledgement that he would not actively oppose them. But everyone in the room understood that it was also a choice. A small choice, carefully hedged, deniable if necessary, but still a choice that moved him from passive observation to active, if limited, participation. The gathering ended. Officers departed separately. At intervals, taking different routes, Hoffmann walked through Berlin streets lit by searchlights, scanning for British bombers, and understood that he had crossed a threshold. Not decisively, not publicly, but in some small way, he had decided that professional duty was not enough anymore. December 1943. Elizabeth and the girls came to Bavaria for Christmas. Hoffmann was granted leave, a rare luxury in the 5th year of war. He took the train south through a Germany that looked increasingly like a nation in decline. Factories with windows blown out from bombing. Rail stations crowded with refugees from the Eastern Territories. Everywhere, the sense that something fundamental had broken and would not be repaired. The estate in Bavaria was untouched. Snow lay clean across fields and forests. The cousins' family welcomed them with warmth that felt like an echo from a different world. For 5 days, they pretended the war existed somewhere else. On Christmas Eve, Hoffmann sat with Elizabeth by a fire while the girls slept upstairs. They did not talk about the war directly. Instead, they talked about after, where they might live when it ended, whether the house on the Wannsee still stood or had been destroyed in the bombing, what schools the girls might attend. Small plans that required believing there would be an after. Elizabeth took his hand. She was 39, still beautiful. though the war had aged her as it aged everyone. How much longer? She asked. Hoffmann calculated. 6 months minimum. Probably 12 to 18 months. The mathematics say late 1904 or early 1905. And then, I don't know. Occupation. Probably Soviet in the East. Western allies in the West. War crimes trials. Dismantling of the military. Germany will cease to exist as we knew it. Will you be safe? He did not answer immediately. Safety depended on so many variables. What happened in the next year? Which side of the final line he ended on? Whether his intelligence work was considered complicity or just following orders? I have taken precautions, he said finally. That was as much as he could promise. January 44. Hoffmann met Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg in a quiet corner of a Wehrmacht administration building. Stauffenberg was 36, an aristocrat who had been severely wounded in North Africa and now served in the replacement army headquarters. He had access to Hitler during military briefings. He was committed to removing Hitler, and he wanted to understand what peace terms the Allies might accept. Hoffmann had prepared an intelligence summary. He laid out the key finding first. The Casablanca Conference in January 1943 had produced a declaration that the Allies would accept only unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. Stauffenberg studied the document. But surely they would distinguish between Germany under Hitler and Germany after Hitler. Hoffmann shook his head. Intelligence from multiple sources suggests otherwise. The Allies have concluded that negotiated peace is what allowed Germany to rearm after the last war. They will not make that mistake again. Whether Hitler is in power or not, Germany will be occupied and disarmed. So removing Hitler accomplishes nothing strategically. It accomplishes everything morally. And it might prevent the worst excesses. Total destruction of German cities. Soviet occupation of all German territory. Mass starvation. Killing Hitler will not save Germany from defeat, but it might save Germany from annihilation. Stauffenberg nodded slowly. Then we proceed anyway. Not because we will get favorable peace terms, but because it is the right thing to do. Hoffmann found himself respecting this man he barely knew. Stauffenberg was not deluded about outcomes. He understood that removing Hitler would not change the strategic situation. He was proceeding anyway because some actions were required by moral necessity rather than tactical advantage. That understanding, that willingness to act despite knowing it would not change the ultimate result, was something Hoffmann had not fully possessed. He had calculated probabilities and maintained professional distance, and convinced himself that providing intelligence to conspirators was sufficient contribution. Looking at Stauffenberg, he understood it was not sufficient, but he also understood that he was not prepared to do more. He had a wife and daughters. He had responsibilities. And he had already gone further than most officers would risk. It was both true and insufficient. The kind of truth that allowed you to sleep at night while knowing you had not done enough. June 1944. Two catastrophes struck simultaneously. On June 6, the Western Allies landed in Normandy. Over 150,000 troops crossed the English Channel in the largest amphibious invasion in history. German defenders, spread thin and hampered by Hitler's refusal to release panzer reserves, could not contain the beachhead. 17 days later, on June 23rd, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, the third anniversary of the German invasion. The target was Army Group Center in Belarus. Over 2 million Soviet troops supported by 5,700 tanks attacked along a 400-mile front. The German defenders numbered about 800,000 men with 900 tanks. Hitler had refused to authorize strategic withdrawal to shorter, more defensible lines. Every inch of ground must be held. The result was catastrophic. Within 1 week, Soviet forces had torn open the German front and begun encircling major formations. The 3rd Panzer Army was destroyed. The 4th Army was encircled near Minsk. The 9th Army was shattered. Hoffmann tracked Bagration from Army Group South headquarters with growing horror. He had provided intelligence warnings. Soviet buildup had been detected. The concentration of forces was too large to miss. Warnings had been issued 2 weeks before the offensive began. Hitler had dismissed the warnings. The Soviets were incapable of launching a major offensive so soon after their spring campaigns. The intelligence was exaggerated. The defenses would hold. In 5 weeks of fighting, Army Group Center ceased to exist as a coherent force. The Germans lost approximately 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, and over 2,000 tanks and assault guns. It was a defeat larger than Stalingrad, though less famous because there was no dramatic siege or surrender, just the complete disintegration of an entire army group. The psychological impact on the German officer corps was profound. Bagration demonstrated that the Red Army could now execute complex multi-front operations more effectively than the Wehrmacht. Soviet mobile forces had advanced nearly 400 miles in 5 weeks, liberating Belarus and reaching the borders of East Prussia. German territory itself was now under threat, and the speed of the collapse showed that the Wehrmacht, so long considered the most professional army in the world, had been surpassed. Hoffmann prepared the assessment knowing no one wanted to read it. Army Group Center destroyed. Normandy beachhead, expanding. Italy stalemated but Allied pressure constant. Strategic reserves exhausted. Production declining due to bombing. Oil supplies critical. Transportation network breaking down. Timeline to defeat, 6 to 12 months. He filed the report and understood that it would be ignored, just as his Stalingrad warnings had been ignored, just as his Kursk assessment had been ignored. The pattern was established. Intelligence would document the catastrophe. Command would ignore the documentation. The catastrophe would occur. And everyone involved would continue doing their jobs, because that was what professional soldiers did. July 20th, 1940. Hoffmann was in Berlin for a planning conference when he heard the explosion. Not literally. He was 15 miles from the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, where the bomb detonated at 12:82 in the afternoon. But he heard about it within hours through the military communication network. Stauffenberg had placed a briefcase containing a bomb under the conference table, where Hitler was conducting a military briefing. Then he had left the room on a pretext. The bomb had exploded. 4 men were killed. Hitler survived with minor injuries. Protected by the heavy oak table and the fact that the bomb had been moved slightly farther from him by another officer who found it in the way. In Berlin, the conspirators activated Operation Valkyrie. Communications went out announcing that Hitler was dead and that the army was assuming control to prevent an SS coup. Army units seized government buildings. SS officers were arrested. Hoffmann monitored the situation from a military communications center. For several hours, it appeared the coup might succeed. The machinery was in motion. Key positions were secured. If Hitler was actually dead, if the SS did not rally, if the Wehrmacht held firm, Germany might have a different government by nightfall. Then reports came from East Prussia. Hitler was alive. He had spoken on the radio. The Valkyrie orders were countermanded by pro-Hitler officers. By midnight, the coup had collapsed. Stauffenberg was shot that evening in the courtyard of the Bendler block. Over the following weeks and months, the Gestapo arrested approximately 7,000 people connected to the plot. Nearly 5,000 were executed after show trials. Field marshals and generals were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks. Their deaths filmed for Hitler to watch. 3 days after the coup attempt, Gestapo officers appeared at Hoffmann's quarters. He was taken to a detention facility and interrogated for 72 hours. They wanted to know about his contacts with conspirators. They wanted to know about the intelligence assessments he had provided. They wanted to know if he had been aware of the plot. Hoffmann told them what he had prepared to say. He had met various officers in the course of his duties. He had provided intelligence assessments on military questions. He had not been aware of any coup planning. His work was strictly professional and apolitical. They did not believe him. They also could not prove anything. His contacts with conspirators had been carefully maintained. No written records. No witnesses who could testify without implicating themselves. After 3 days, they released him with a warning. He was being watched. Any hint of defeatism or disloyalty would result in immediate arrest. Steiner was also interrogated. He commanded a corps on the Eastern Front, far from Berlin, but the Gestapo reached everywhere. His interrogation lasted longer because his name had appeared on a list of officers the conspirators hoped to recruit. He was demoted to division command and transferred to the Western Front. The purge was designed to terrorize the officer corps into absolute obedience. It succeeded. After July 20th, any thought of internal resistance to Hitler evaporated. The SS now monitored the military at every level. Speaking openly about Germany's dire situation meant death. August 1944. Hoffmann visited Steiner before his departure to France. They met in a forest clearing near the Eastern Front, away from headquarters, away from anyone who might overhear. It had rained that morning and the trees dripped water with a sound like clocks counting down. Steiner looked worse than he had in May. The interrogation had left marks. Not physical, but something in his eyes had changed. The certainty was gone. The absolute confidence in professional duty had developed cracks. They did not waste time on pleasantries. Your friends tried to kill Hitler, Steiner said. It was not quite an accusation, more an observation. They were not my friends. I provided intelligence assessments, nothing more. The Gestapo thinks otherwise. The Gestapo suspects everyone, but they released me. No evidence. Steiner looked at him for a long moment. Were you part of it? Hoffmann had prepared this answer too. If I had been part of it, I would not tell you, because telling you would implicate you, and because you would feel obligated to report me. So whether I was or was not involved, my answer must be the same. I was not involved. The logic was sound. It was also an admission of sorts. Steiner understood this. It's over now, Steiner said. The last chance for an internal solution. Now we fight until they make us stop. We're fighting for nothing. Heinrich, you know that. I know you know that. Everyone with any intelligence knows that. The war is lost. Every day we continue means more deaths for an outcome that is already determined. So what would you have me do? Surrender my division. Encourage my men to desert. Refuse orders. I would have you stop pretending that following orders absolves you of responsibility for what those orders accomplish. Steiner's voice rose. I am a soldier. I follow lawful orders until lawful authority tells me to stop. That is professional duty. Hoffmann met his eyes. We enabled genocide. We stood by while millions were murdered. We followed orders that we knew were wrong. And now we're following orders that we know will accomplish nothing except to multiply suffering. Professional duty and without moral judgment is not noble. It's cowardice dressed in uniform. The words hung between them like an accusation that could not be withdrawn. Steiner stepped forward. His face was rigid with anger. You want to talk about moral responsibility? Fine. Where were you when the real decisions were being made? Where were you in 1933 when Hitler took power? Where were you in 1938 when they destroyed the synagogues? Where were you when the orders came to shoot commissars and Jews? You sat in your intelligence office and prepared reports and told yourself you were just analyzing data. You were complicit in everything I was complicit in. The only difference is you've decided to grow a conscience now that it's convenient. The accusation struck because it was true. Hoffmann had participated in the same system. He had followed the same orders. He had maintained professional distance from atrocities he knew were occurring. His late awakening did not erase earlier complicity. You're right, Hoffmann said quietly. I was complicit. I am complicit. Every report I file, every briefing I conduct, every day I wear this uniform. I'm participating in something I know is wrong. The difference is I've stopped pretending that professional competence excuses moral failure. Steiner's anger seemed to drain away. He looked tired, older than 54, a man who had spent his life serving an institution that had become something he could no longer defend but could not abandon. Then court-martial me after we surrender. He said, until then, I fight. That's all I know how to do. He turned and walked toward his vehicle. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back. For what it's worth. Werner, I hope you survive. I hope you get to see your wife and daughters after this ends. I hope they understand why you did what you did. I'm not sure anyone will understand why I did what I did. But I'm a soldier. And soldiers fight. He climbed into the Kubelwagen and drove away. Hoffmann stood alone in the clearing and listened to the trees drip water and understood that he had just witnessed the last conversation he would ever have with Heinrich Steiner as a friend. They had become representatives of different responses to the same terrible knowledge. Steiner would fight until the end because that was what his understanding of duty required. Hoffmann would continue providing intelligence and maintaining his position and telling himself that small acts of resistance mattered. Neither response was adequate. Neither would prevent the catastrophe now unfolding. Both men knew it, and both men would carry that knowledge to whatever end awaited them. September 1940. The situation maps told the story with brutal clarity. In the West, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. Paris liberated in August, Brussels in September. By October, they would reach the German border. In the East, Soviet armies had entered Poland and Romania. East Prussia was under threat. The Wehrmacht was being compressed from both sides with no strategic reserves and no realistic hope of stabilizing either front. Hoffmann prepared casualty projections for the final phase of the war. The mathematics were straightforward. German armed forces currently numbered approximately 7 million men. They were losing territory at an accelerating rate. They were outnumbered on both fronts. Production could not replace losses. Timeline to military collapse. 3 to 6 months. Projected casualties in that period. Minimum 2 million German military deaths. Possibly 3 million. Civilian casualties from bombing, ground combat, and Soviet revenge would add another 2 million minimum. Total, 4 to 5 million deaths in the final 6 months of a war that was already lost. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. No intelligence assessment would change strategy. No warning would be heeded. The machine would grind on until it destroyed itself completely. That night, Hoffmann sat in his office with the projection reports and thought about choices. He could continue doing his job, providing intelligence that would be ignored. He could resign, which meant execution for defeatism. He could flee, which meant abandoning Elizabeth and the girls and being hunted as a deserter. Or he could do what he was doing. Stay in position, provide accurate intelligence, document the catastrophe with professional precision. Hope that somehow this record would matter after the war ended. It was not heroism. It was not resistance. It was simply the least terrible option available to a man who had waited too long to act and now found himself with no good choices remaining. The terrible knowledge that had come to him at Stalingrad had spread through the entire officer corps by late 1944. Everyone knew the war was lost. Everyone knew that continuing meant pointless death. Everyone had their reasons for continuing anyway. Fear, duty, habit, hope that somehow the situation would change, belief that their oath meant something even when serving leaders who had betrayed every value that oath supposedly represented. Hoffmann understood all those reasons. He felt them himself, and he understood that none of them were sufficient justification for what they were doing. But knowing that and acting on it were different things. And by the time you understood the difference, it was usually too late to matter. Outside, the September night was dark. Somewhere in that darkness, Heinrich Steiner was leading his division in France. Somewhere in that darkness, Soviet armies were preparing their final offensives. Somewhere in that darkness, 4 to 5 million people were moving toward deaths that had already been mathematically determined. And in a small office in Army Group headquarters, Colonel Werner Hoffmann prepared another intelligence report that would document the disaster with professional precision while changing nothing about its outcome. October 1944. The reports came in fragments at first, isolated incidents that intelligence officers tried to verify through multiple sources before including in official assessments. A village in East Prussia where Soviet troops had killed every civilian. Another village where women of all ages had been raped systematically. A third where German prisoners were executed after surrender. By late October, the pattern was undeniable. The Red Army had entered German soil, and what followed was an orgy of revenge that confirmed every nightmare the Wehrmacht had spent 3 years dreading. The town of Nemmersdorf in East Prussia had been briefly occupied by Soviet forces before a German counterattack retook it. What they found destroyed any remaining illusions about what Soviet occupation would mean. 72 women and girls murdered. The youngest was 8. Many had been raped before being killed. Civilian men were shot or beaten to death. Some were crucified on barn doors. The brutality was methodical and total. Nazi propaganda had spent years warning Germans about what would happen if the Soviets won. Posters showed Asiatic hordes destroying civilization. Radio broadcasts described Bolshevik barbarism. Most educated Germans had dismissed this as exaggeration designed to motivate resistance. The reports from East Prussia proved it was not exaggeration. If anything, the propaganda had understated what Soviet revenge would entail. Hoffmann thought about Elizabeth and the girls safe in Bavaria. The Western Allies would reach Bavaria first. The Americans would not do this. But millions of Germans in the Eastern territories had no such protection. They faced the Red Army with full knowledge of what was coming. The terrible irony was inescapable. This was what German forces had done to Soviet civilians for 3 years. The Einsatzgruppen killings, the mass starvations, the deportations and murders and systematic destruction of entire populations. Now it was coming back, returned with the fury of people who had suffered beyond endurance and would show no mercy. The Wehrmacht had participated in or facilitated crimes so enormous that Soviet revenge, however terrible, was the predictable result. This did not make the revenge moral. It made it inevitable. November 1940. Hitler ordered preparation of a massive counteroffensive in the West. The plan was to drive through the Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and capture Antwerp, splitting British and American forces. If successful, it might force the Western Allies to negotiate. At minimum, it would demonstrate that Germany could still attack. The operation was codenamed Watch on the Rhine. It would become known to the Ally as the Battle of the Bulge. Hoffmann was assigned to provide intelligence assessment on Allied dispositions and response capabilities. He spent 3 weeks analyzing the plan and understood within days that it was based on wishful thinking rather than operational reality. The offensive required surprise, rapid advance, and capture of fuel depots along the route because German forces had insufficient fuel to sustain the operation. It assumed Allied forces would not react quickly. It assumed weather would remain poor enough to ground Allied aircraft. It assumed logistics that were already strained could support a major offensive. Every assumption was optimistic. Most were unlikely. Several were impossible. Hoffmann prepared his assessment with careful language. The operation had low probability of achieving strategic objectives. Allied forces in the Ardennes were weak, but could be reinforced rapidly. Weather patterns suggested clearing was likely within days. Fuel availability was a critical path dependency with high failure risk. His conclusion? The offensive would achieve initial surprise and create a salient in Allied lines. Then it would stall as fuel ran out and Allied air power intervened. German casualties would be heavy. Strategic reserves would be consumed. The offensive would accomplish nothing except to accelerate defeat by removing forces needed to defend Germany itself. The assessment was filed and ignored. December 16th, 1944. The offensive began before dawn with artillery barrage and mass infantry assault. The Americans, thinly spread across the Ardennes sector, were caught off guard. German forces achieved breakthrough in multiple locations. Panzers raced westward through snow and fog. For 3 days, it looked like the offensive might succeed. The bulge in American lines expanded. Key road junctions were threatened. American forces fell back in confusion. Then the weather cleared. December 23rd. Allied aircraft filled the skies. Fighter bombers strafed German columns. Heavy bombers destroyed supply routes. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a fraction of its former strength, could not contest control of the air. And on the ground, American forces held. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne refused to surrender despite being surrounded. Other units established defensive lines. Reinforcements arrived. The German advance stalled, then stopped, then began to retreat. By early January, the bulge was eliminated. The offensive had failed. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of irreplaceable tanks were lost. The strategic reserve that might have delayed Soviet offensives in the east had been wasted on an operation that achieved nothing. Hoffmann prepared the after-action assessment knowing no one wanted to read it. The offensive had failed exactly as predicted. The assumptions had proven false. The logistics had collapsed. Allied response had been faster and stronger than German planning anticipated. He concluded the report with a calculation. The Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. There were no forces remaining to counter Soviet offensives in the east or Allied advances in the west. The timeline to military collapse had compressed from 6 months to 3 months maximum. The report was classified and filed. No one commented on its accuracy. No one acknowledged that the disaster had been predictable and predicted. January 1945. On January 12th, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. Over 2 million troops attacked from Poland toward Germany. They advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks, reaching the Oder River just 40 miles from Berlin. There was no stopping them. The forces that might have slowed the advance had been destroyed at the Ardennes. What remained were understrength divisions with minimal ammunition and fuel. Boys and old men conscripted into Volkssturm units, and officers who knew they were conducting delaying actions with no strategic purpose. Hoffmann tracked the Soviet advance on maps that showed the front line moving westward day by day, mile by mile, swallowing East Prussia and Pomerania and Silesia. Behind the advancing armies came refugees, millions of German civilians fleeing west, carrying what they could, trying to reach American or British lines before the Soviets caught them. The roads were clogged with people. The temperature was below freezing. Hundreds of thousands would die during the flight. Many were overtaken by Soviet forces. What happened to them replicated Nemmersdorf across 1,000 towns and villages. In the west, Allied armies closed to the Rhine in February and crossed it in March. They faced determined resistance in places, but the outcome was never in doubt. By April, both Allied and Soviet forces were deep inside Germany, systematically destroying what remained of German military power. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Units surrendered when they could. Officers ignored orders to fight to the last man. Some tried to negotiate local surrenders to Western forces before Soviets arrived. The command structure, so long praised for its professional excellence, was breaking under the weight of inevitable defeat. March 1945. The last letter from Heinrich Steiner arrived through unofficial channels. A Wehrmacht chaplain smuggled it out of the collapsing Western Front and delivered it to Hoffmann at his headquarters, which had been relocated 3 times in as many months as Soviet forces advanced. The letter was brief, but written in Steiner's precise hand but with shakiness that suggested exhaustion or injury or something else. Werner, I am writing this in case we do not speak again. My division is dissolving. We have boys who cry for their mothers and old men who can barely hold rifles. We have no ammunition reserves, no fuel, no hope of reinforcement. I have spent 30 years learning to be a soldier. I understand tactics and logistics and how to lead men in battle. None of it matters now. We are playing at war while waiting for the end. You were right about professional duty. I see that now. Following orders seems sufficient when I believe those orders serve Germany, but orders that serve no purpose except to prolong suffering are not worth following. I will surrender when the time comes. Not because I am a coward, but because my duty is to my men now, not to orders from people who have already lost this war but refuse to acknowledge it. If you survive, tell my wife I tried. Tell her that professional duty was not enough, and I learned that too late. Heinrich. The letter was not signed with rank or unit. It was simply a communication between 2 men who had been friends before the war tore that friendship apart. Hoffmann read it twice, then filed it with his personal papers. He did not respond because he did not know where Steiner's division was, and by the time a letter might reach him, the war would likely be over. April 1945. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was in his bunker refusing to acknowledge reality. The government was non-functional. What remained of the Wehrmacht was conducting last stands that accomplished nothing except to add names to casualty lists that no one was maintaining anymore. On April 20th, Hoffmann received a report through informal channels. General Heinrich Steiner's division had surrendered to American forces near the Elbe River 3 days earlier. Steiner had ordered his men to lay down their weapons and had personally delivered the surrender to an American colonel. That same day, April 20th, Steiner had been found dead in his quarters, a single gunshot wound, his service pistol beside him. A brief note. The note reached Hoffmann through the chaplain who had delivered the earlier letter. It was addressed to Steiner's wife, but the chaplain thought Hoffmann should see it first. I followed orders professionally. It was not enough. I see that now. Werner tried to tell me. I did not listen. Forgive me. The note was signed and dated April 20th, 1945. Hitler's birthday. Whether that was intentional symbolism or coincidence, Hoffmann would never know. He sat alone in his office and tried to process what he was feeling. Grief for a friend lost, anger at waste, recognition that Steiner had reached the same conclusion Hoffmann had reached months earlier, but had chosen a different response. Steiner could not live with what he had enabled, so he had ended it in the only way that made sense to him. Hoffmann would live with it. He would carry the burden of survival and memory. April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Admiral Karl Dönitz became head of state and attempted to negotiate partial surrender, offering to capitulate to Western allies while continuing to fight the Soviets. The allies refused. Surrender would be total and simultaneous on all fronts. May 7th, 1945. General Alfred Jodl signed the instrument of unconditional surrender at Supreme Allied Headquarters in Reims, France. The war in Europe was over. Hoffmann was present as part of the German delegation. He watched Jodl sign the document with mechanical precision. A professional soldier completing his final official duty. There was no drama. No defiant speeches, just signatures on paper and the acknowledgement that Germany had been defeated totally. Afterward, in a holding area where German officers waited to be processed as prisoners, Hoffmann sat alone and calculated final statistics. The war had lasted 5 years and 8 months. Approximately 60 million people had died worldwide. German military casualties exceeded 5 million. German civilian casualties approached 2 million. The Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others the regime considered undesirable. The last year of the war, from summer 1944 to May 1945, had accounted for approximately 3 million German military casualties and 2 million German civilian deaths. More Germans had died in the final year than in any previous year of the war. All of it preventable. All of it the direct consequence of continuing to fight after the terrible knowledge had made clear that defeat was inevitable. June 1945 through March 1946. The occupation was both better and worse than Hoffmann had feared. American forces were correct, but not friendly. They were processing millions of German prisoners, sorting Wehrmacht from SS, identifying war criminals, beginning the vast machinery of occupation and denazification. Hoffmann was held in a prisoner camp near Frankfurt. His intelligence background made him valuable. Allied interrogators wanted information about Soviet capabilities, about German intelligence methods, about the decision-making process that had prolonged the war. He answered their questions honestly. He provided details on Soviet order of battle and German intelligence failures and the command structure that had enabled Hitler's catastrophic interference in military operations. In November 1945, he received word that Elizabeth and the girls had survived the war. They were still at the estate in Bavaria. Now in the American occupation zone, they were safe. They had enough food. They asked when he might be released. He did not know. His case was complicated by his intelligence role and his marginal connection to the July 20 plot. The Americans suspected he knew more than he was telling. They were not wrong. But what he knew implicated both living and dead. And he had learned from Stalingrad that some knowledge was worth protecting, even at personal cost. In March 1946, he was informed that he would be called to testify at the Nuremberg trials. Not as a defendant, as a witness. The prosecution wanted his testimony about Wehrmacht intelligence operations and the decision-making process that had continued the war after military defeat became inevitable. November 1946. The courtroom was surreal. German officers who months earlier had commanded armies now sat in the dock facing charges of crimes against humanity. American, British, French, and Soviet prosecutors presented evidence of atrocities so enormous that the human mind struggled to comprehend the scale. Hoffmann was called to testify about intelligence assessments and command decisions. He was sworn in and took his place at the witness stand. The prosecutor was American, methodical and precise. He established Hoffmann's credentials as an intelligence officer and then asked the key question, Colonel Hoffmann, when did German military leadership know that the war was lost? Hoffmann answered without hesitation. By February 1943, at the latest, after the Stalingrad encirclement and the production statistics that demonstrated Germany could not win a war of industrial attrition, any competent analysis showed that defeat was mathematically inevitable. And yet the war continued for more than 2 years after that realization. Yes. Why? The reasons were complex. Some officers remained loyal to Hitler, despite evidence of his incompetence. Some believed that professional soldiers followed orders regardless of personal opinions. Some feared consequences of refusing orders. Some hoped for negotiated peace. Some feared what would happen if Germany lost completely. But the fundamental answer was that professional military culture emphasized obedience over moral judgment. We told ourselves that following orders was sufficient duty, that analyzing intelligence accurately was sufficient contribution. We were wrong. The prosecutor pressed further. You personally knew the war was lost by February 1943. Yes. And you continued to serve in your intelligence capacity for more than 2 years after that. Yes. Why? I told myself that I was providing accurate intelligence that might help end the war sooner. I told myself that refusing orders would mean execution and accomplish nothing. I told myself that I had a family to protect. All of that was true. But the deeper truth is that I was afraid of consequences, afraid of responsibility. I did the minimum necessary to tell myself I was resisting while maintaining the maximum safety for myself. Every death after February 1943 is partly on my hands. I knew continuing was futile. I continued anyway. May 1947. Hoffmann was released on a warm spring morning that felt like emerging from a tomb. 2 years as a prisoner had aged him in ways that went beyond the gray in his hair or the lines around his eyes. He had lost 20 pounds. His uniform returned to him for the journey home, hung loose on his frame. He took a train to Bavaria through a Germany that bore scars deeper than rubble and reconstruction. Cities were being rebuilt, but something fundamental had been broken that concrete and steel could not repair. The estate appeared through morning mist like a memory made solid. Elizabeth was waiting at the gate. She was 44 now, her hair streaked with gray, her face marked by years of worry. They stood looking at each other for a long moment before embracing. No words seemed adequate to bridge 2 years of separation and all that those years contained. Anna was 17, Sophie 15. They had grown into young women while he was gone. They greeted him with careful formality, as if uncertain how to approach a father who had become a stranger. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Elizabeth and Hoffmann sat in the parlor. The silence between them was comfortable. The silence of people who had shared 16 years of marriage and understood that not everything required words. How bad was it? She asked finally. The testimony. No, all of it. Hoffmann looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent 2 years doing nothing while the world was remade. Worse than I can explain. Better than I deserved. Elizabeth took his hand. You are here. That is what matters. Is it? He looked at her. I enabled a catastrophe. I knew the war was lost, and I continued serving the machinery that prolonged it. 2 million people died in the last year. I could have refused. I should have refused. You would be dead. Yes. And perhaps that would have been the more moral choice. She squeezed his hand harder. Do not say that. Do not ever say that. Your daughters need their father. I need my husband. Whatever you did or did not do, you are here. And that matters. Does it? What good is survival if it comes at the cost of complicity? Then make it mean something. You survived. Use that survival to ensure it does not happen again. Tell people what you learned. Teach the next generation. Make your survival count for something beyond guilt. June 1947. Hoffmann took the train north to visit the Stalingrad Memorial that had been erected in a cemetery outside Berlin. The memorial was simple, a stone wall inscribed with names. Thousands of names. He found Thomas Kepler's name in the third row from the bottom. Major Thomas Kepler, infantry, died February 1943. Stalingrad. The letters were carved deep into stone. Permanent, unchangeable. Hoffmann stood before the name and removed the letter from his pocket. He had carried it for 4 years. Through interrogations and imprisonment and testimony, the envelope was worn, the wax paper yellowed, but Thomas's handwriting remained legible. He had never opened it. It was addressed to Elizabeth, and whatever final words Thomas had written belonged to her. But Hoffmann had carried it as a reminder of what inaction costs. He placed the sealed envelope at the base of the memorial. Below Thomas's name, a final delivery. 4 years late. Tell Werner he was right. Thomas had written in his last letter, tell him that professional soldiers should maybe question more and obey less. Tell him I learned that too late. Hoffmann knelt in the grass and spoke to a name carved in stone. I learned too late as well. We all did, but I survived. And you did not. and I will carry that for the rest of my life. He stayed at the memorial until the sun began to set, then walked back to the station. On the train south, he thought about what Elizabeth had said. Make your survival mean something. He did not know if that was possible, but he knew he had to try. July 20th, 1947, the second anniversary of the bomb that failed. Hoffmann received a message that Heinrich Steiner's widow wished to see him. She lived in a suburb of Hamburg, in a building that had somehow survived the firebombing. The apartment was small but neat, decorated with photographs of Steiner in uniform at various stages of his career. Lieutenant in the First War, captain in the interwar years, general commanding a corps. A professional soldier's life documented in black and white. Frau Steiner was 53, her hair completely gray, her face marked by loss that went beyond widowhood. She served coffee in the parlor and they sat in uncomfortable silence until she spoke. The chaplain gave me Heinrich's letter, the one he left before he died. Hoffmann nodded. It reached me as well. She looked at him with eyes that had wept themselves dry months ago. He wrote another letter that day. To you. This one was sealed in an envelope. She handed it to him. The envelope was standard military issue, addressed in Steiner's precise handwriting. Colonel Werner Hoffmann. Personal. Hoffmann opened it carefully. The letter inside was a single page. Werner, by the time you read this, I will have done what I should have done months ago. I cannot live with what I enabled. Not the strategic failures, not the tactical defeats, but the moment I knew we were wrong and continued anyway. You remember our coffee in Kharkov, May 1943. You showed me the production numbers. I calculated the same conclusion you did. We could not win, and I told you that soldiers follow orders regardless. I believed that then. I was wrong. There was a specific moment when I should have refused, October 1943. After Kiev fell, I received orders to execute a scorched earth withdrawal, burn villages, destroy food supplies, drive civilians from their homes into winter cold. I knew these orders would kill thousands of non-combatants. I knew the military necessity was questionable. I knew it was wrong. I followed the orders anyway, because that is what professional soldiers do, except it is not what moral human beings do. You tried to tell me that professional duty included moral judgment. I did not listen. I told myself that obedience was sufficient. I was wrong. And every person who died in that withdrawal, every child who froze, every family that starved, died because I followed orders I knew were immoral. I cannot undo that. I cannot make it right. All I can do is ensure I do not continue enabling evil. By the time you read this, I will have stopped. I do not ask for forgiveness. I ask only that you remember, professional competence without moral courage is not neutral. It is participation. Learn from my failure. Teach others. Ensure the next generation of soldiers understands that some orders must be refused, whatever the cost. Your friend, who learned too late. Heinrich. Hoffmann read the letter twice. His hands trembled slightly. Frau Steiner watched him with quiet intensity. He was a good man, she said. He tried to do his duty as he understood it. And when he realized his understanding was wrong, he could not live with what he had done. Hoffmann folded the letter carefully. He was a better man than I am. I understood the same things he did. I made the same calculations. And I survived by doing less than I should have while telling myself I was doing enough. She shook her head. You survived. Heinrich did not. I do not know which required more courage, but I know that survival means you can teach what he learned. You can make his death mean something beyond waste. That evening, Hoffmann returned to Bavaria. He sat with Elizabeth in the parlor as darkness fell and showed her Steiner's letter. She read it in silence, then set it down carefully. What will you do? She asked. I do not know. I am a colonel without an army, in a country that no longer exists, carrying knowledge that should have led to action years ago. What can I do? Tell people, teach, write, ensure that Heinrich's question is answered by the next generation. Some orders must be refused. Professional soldiers must know when duty requires disobedience. He looked at his wife. And if they ask why I did not refuse, if they ask why I continued serving when I knew it was wrong, then tell them the truth. That you were afraid, that you did less than you should have, that you learned too late. And that learning too late is what makes teaching others so important. Elizabeth took his hand. We cannot change what happened. We can only affect what comes next. Make your survival mean something. Werner, for Thomas, for Heinrich, for all of them. August. On a warm evening at the estate in Bavaria, Hoffmann sat with Elizabeth on the terrace overlooking fields that had survived the war unchanged. The girls were inside, Anna reading, Sophie practicing piano. The sound of Beethoven drifted through open windows. Beautiful and melancholy, Elizabeth asked the question she had never asked before. Will you ever forgive yourself? Hoffmann watched the sun set over fields where wheat grew as it had grown for centuries, indifferent to human catastrophe. No, he said quietly. Forgiveness is not what I seek. I do not deserve it. Then what do you seek? To ensure others understand what we learn, that professional military skill is not enough. That following orders is not sufficient duty. That there comes a moment when moral courage must override institutional obedience. Steiner understood that at the end. I understood it too late to matter. The question is whether the next generation will understand it in time. She was quiet for a long moment. And if they ask you what you would do differently, everything? I would refuse orders after Stalingrad. I would join the July 20 conspirators openly instead of helping marginally. I would accept court-martial, execution, whatever consequence, because I know now what I did not fully understand then. Obeying immoral orders, even professionally, makes you responsible for their results. Doing your job well while ignoring the moral context of that job is not neutrality. It is participation. And how many young officers will have your courage if they know it leads to execution? That is the question. Is it not? How do you teach people to refuse orders when refusal means death? I do not know, but I know that not teaching them means they will repeat our failures. I spent 2 years at Nuremberg watching prosecutors document atrocities. Every defendant said the same thing. I was following orders. I was doing my duty. I was serving my country. And every one of them was guilty. Because following orders is not a defense when the orders are wrong. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. Then teach them. You have survived. You have knowledge. Use it. Do not spend the rest of your life in guilt. Spend it in warning. Make them understand what you learned, so they do not have to learn it the same way. Hoffmann looked at his wife. This woman who had survived bombing and occupation and 2 years of uncertainty, who had kept their daughter safe and their family intact while he was imprisoned, who was now telling him that survival came with obligation rather than shame. I will teach, he said finally. I will tell them what we knew and when we knew it and what we did with that knowledge. I will tell them about Thomas frozen in Stalingrad and Heinrich dead by his own hand and the 2 million who died in the last year because professional soldiers continued following orders they knew were wrong. I will tell them that military ethics is not an abstract concept. It is the difference between honorable service and criminal complicity. And I will tell them that the question is not whether refusing orders is difficult. The question is whether following immoral orders is acceptable. The answer is no. It has always been no. We simply lacked the courage to say it when it mattered. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Inside, Sophie's piano playing shifted to something lighter. A Bach invention, precise and mathematical. The terrible knowledge that Germany's war was lost had come to its military leadership in February 1943. What they had done with that knowledge, how professional soldiers had continued serving a catastrophic cause for 28 months while millions died, was now history. But history was not fate. It was warning. And Colonel Werner Hoffmann, who had carried the burden of that knowledge for 4 years, who had survived when better men had not, who had learned too late what should have been obvious from the beginning, would spend whatever years remain ensuring that the next generation understood the lesson his generation had learned in blood and ash and frozen corpses in Stalingrad. Professional competence without moral courage was not service. It was complicity. And the terrible knowledge that should have led to refusal had instead led to obedience. That was the crime. That was the lesson. That was what he would teach until his last breath. In the hope that somewhere, somehow, the next time professional soldiers faced immoral orders, they would have the courage that his generation lacked. To refuse, to resist, to accept whatever consequence came from standing against evil rather than serving it competently. That was the only redemption available. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but the possibility that others might learn what he learned too late. He held Elizabeth's hand and watched the sun set and carried his burden into whatever future remained. Colonel Werner Hoffmann taught military ethics at a German war college from 1949 until his retirement in 1975. He never wrote memoirs. He never sought publicity. He simply taught young officers one lesson, repeated in different ways for 26 years. Some orders must be refused, whatever the cost. When students asked what he would have done differently, he answered honestly, everything. He would have refused earlier, risked more, chosen moral courage over professional safety. The question, he told them, is not whether refusing orders is dangerous. The question is whether following immoral orders is acceptable. It is not. It never was. We simply lacked the courage to say so when it mattered. He died in 1982. At age 80, his last words to Elizabeth were not about forgiveness or redemption. They were about a responsibility he hoped he had fulfilled. Tell them to question, he whispered. Tell them to refuse when refusal is right. Tell them that following orders is never sufficient excuse. She promised she would. The terrible knowledge had come to Germany's generals in 1943. They had known the war was lost. They had continued fighting anyway. And millions had died because professional competence without moral courage is not service. It is complicity. That was the lesson. That was the warning. That was what Werner Hoffmann spent the rest of his life teaching, in the hope that the next generation would have the courage his generation lacked. Some orders must be refused. That is the burden of moral service. That is the price of honor. That is what it means to be a soldier who serves humanity rather than merely following commands. The question remains for every generation: when should soldiers refuse orders? The answer remains unchanged: when following those orders makes them complicit in evil. That was true in 1943. It remains true today. It will remain true tomorrow. The terrible knowledge demands terrible courage. May those who come after find it sooner than those who came before.